with how much? Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Today is April 24th, 2010. Okay, we've been doing studying Sutta number 22 in the Majjhima Nikaya. This is the Alagaddupama Sutta, the Simile of the snake. And so far we've completed 2 classes on this sutta. And in the last class I did the presentation of the standard, called as the argument or logical proof, you could say, of the teaching of anatta or non-self. So it's not really intended to be a logical proof or a logical demonstration, but it's a kind of guide to contemplation and to insight. So I just want to go over this argument again, just because this will lead on to the next sections of the sutta. So here we're on page 232, paragraph 26. So the Buddha begins by investigating what are called the 5 aggregates. The 5 aggregates are the 5 groups of factors that constitute a living being, a sentient being. So what we refer to as ourselves, what we are, our personal identity, is a collection of these 5 aggregates. But it's not just a chance collection, like taking 5 different types of stones and putting them into a pile. But we have to understand that these 5 factors are always interwoven, interdependent, supporting and conditioning one another. And because they're interwoven so closely, we habitually, through beginningless time, we grasp upon this collection of factors as being a real self, a real I, a truly existing personal I. And according to the Buddha's teaching, it's this grasping of the idea of I that is the prime manifestation of ignorance and clinging. And it's this grasping of the idea of I, of self, that keeps us in bondage to samsara, the round of birth and death. And so in order to bring liberation from samsara, the Buddha has to teach the way to direct insight into the selfless nature of the 5 aggregates. And now he does this by basing his presentation on 2 other characteristics of the 5 aggregates that are easier to see, easier to understand. These 2 other characteristics are impermanence and dukkha, or suffering or unsatisfactoriness. And so of all of these 3 characteristics, impermanence, suffering, and non-self, The one which is most immediately evident is impermanence. Maybe it seems to us that our body, our states of mind are lasting through time, but when one develops very sharp mindfulness and concentration and then attends to the body and the mind, then one could see how they are constantly arising, changing, and passing away. And so the Buddha starts with the first aggregate, which is called the aggregate of material form. This is physical form, or the body, the substance, the factor that makes up the body. And then he asked the monks, what do you think? Is material form permanent or impermanent? Then the monks answer, it's impermanent. Okay, not only in the sense that the body grows old and dies, that is, you can say that's the gross aspect of impermanence. But the subtle aspect of impermanence is that the form of the body, it's always changing. So even as I hold my hand out here, if I really pay close attention to the hand, I can feel within the hand always changing sensations. Those changing sensations indicate that the material substance of the hand is always changing. So we know from, even this is supported by modern biology, if we look into the nature of the body, we see the body is made up of little cells, and then the little cells are made up of a kind of substance, cytoplasm, it's like a protoplasm, and different types. There's a nucleus, cytoplasm, and if we look at it through a high-powered microscope, we see always it's a beehive of activity. Even when we're sound asleep, not aware of anything in the world, but billions of processes are going on in every cell in the body. So things are coming into being, say the protoplasm, it's being produced, other protoplasm is being destroyed and cleared out. Okay, so everything in form is impermanent. Then the Buddha asks us, what is impermanent? It's better in the Pali, dukkha or sukha. It doesn't really mean is it suffering or happiness in the usual sense, but is it, you could say, is it unpleasurable or pleasurable? And if one looks into the nature of impermanence, we see that things that are always changing, passing away, perishing, they're not really a basis for security, for happiness, for well-being. Things are always undependable. Like one day you can be in the peak of health, happy, joyful, vigorous. Then you get a little itching in the throat, and at night you feel a fever coming on, and the next day you're lying in bed, oh, miserable. Of course, the misery changes when you recover from the cold and you feel strong and vigorous and you think you're happy again. But eventually everything in this bodily existence ends in old age, gray hair, wrinkled skin, poor memory, feeble faculties, going blind, difficult hearing, and then eventual death. So it's ever impermanent. If we really look at it closely, we find even when we're in the peak of health, high point of vitality, but even that strength and vigor and pleasure that we're experiencing, it's casting a shadow of suffering. And so that suffering, it's like the shadow always ready to catch up with us. And so therefore it's unsatisfactory or dukkha. So material form is impermanent, it's unsatisfactory, and then it's constantly undergoing change. And so then the Buddha says, is this fit to be regarded thus? This is mine, this I am, this is myself. So if this body is always changing, unsatisfactory, and bound to be given up, to be relinquished, can we say this is myself? And here maybe in the Western or the Western way of thinking, we could say, yeah, this is myself. But against the background of the Indian way of thinking, what is called the self, the atta in Pali, the atma in Sanskrit, this is always assumed to be something which is permanent, which exists forever, and which is in perfect command of itself. So it's a source of, you could say, a source of inner power, a source of control and mastery over itself, and capable of lasting forever. And so if this body, material form, changes, we can't command it and master it to our liking, and if it eventually just breaks down and passes away, we can't say, it's mine, it's I, it's myself. So the monks say, no, Venerable Sir. Okay, then the Buddha raises the same questions about feeling. So what is feeling? We have three kinds of feelings: pleasant feeling, painful feeling, and neutral feeling. The feeling that's not pleasant, not painful. Okay, if we look at these feelings, we see the feelings are always changing from moment to moment. Like even if one is in a state of happiness, pleasant feeling, one looks into the mind and one sees that it's not just one feeling that's lasting, but it's different thoughts arising, and each thought is accompanied by its own momentary pleasant feeling. And even say if you're sitting in meditation for a long time, and then you feel some pain in the legs or the back, you think this pain has been going on for such a long time, it's going to be going on forever. But if you pay attention to the pain and just turn it from an annoyance into an object of observation, you see that what you call this oppressive pain is actually a sequence or series of moments of pain. One moment the pain might be really sharp. Next moment it will be dull, a little dull and oppressive. The next moment it will be rising and falling very quickly. The next moment it will be sort of extending with some degree of continuity. Then it might subside, rise again, until when you really look very, very closely at the pain, it's a little bit like a series of radio waves or light waves just flashing into being and flashing out of being. So the feeling, it's impermanent, always changing, whether pleasure or pain. And then again, because the feeling is always changing, it's unsatisfactory. So even the pleasant feelings, the joyful feelings, because they change, we have no command over them. We can't say, let me enjoy pleasure forever. Let me always be happy. And so even the pleasure is unsatisfactory. Okay, since the feelings are impermanent, connected to suffering, and subject to change, again, they lack the permanence, the self-mastery, the continuous happiness that's to be expected of a self, of an Atma. And so the feelings too, we say, not mine, not I, not myself. And similarly, perceptions are always changing. Sometimes I'm seeing an object with the eye, sometimes I'm hearing sounds, sometimes I'm smelling an odor, tasting maybe some snack or food, feeling sensations with the body, thinking thoughts with the mind. So all of this is changing the perceptions. So perceptions are impermanent. I can't always have pleasant perceptions. Sometimes there will come disagreeable perceptions. I meet people I dislike. I get into traffic jams if I'm driving. I miss my train or my plane or my bus, and my mind is upset. Okay, so I experience things that I dislike, and so the perceptions are bound up with suffering. So the perceptions, not mine, not I, not myself. Then the fourth group of factors is called the sankharas, the volitional activities. Acts of will, acts of desire, planning, projecting, willing, acting, constructing, building, doing, making. All of these volitional activities arise and fall away. So in the morning, I'm planning what I'm going to have for breakfast. When I'm eating breakfast, I'm thinking, what am I going to have for lunch? When I finish the lunch, then I think, what am I going to have for a snack or for a drink in the afternoon or evening? What am I going to do today? What am I going to do tomorrow? So these plans, projects, acts, deeds, always changing. And then often my desires, wishes, plans, sometimes even the deeds, they're not subject to my perfect control. So we have maybe the extreme case is what they call the obsessive compulsive disorder. Like a person has an obsession that they have to wash their hands 20 times a day. And so even if they tell themselves, there's no reason for me to be washing my hands so often, no reason to be washing my hands so often. But I just put my hand on the table, maybe I'm getting germs. Oh, if I get the germs, I might get sick. If I get sick, then I'll run up big medical bills and be an inconvenience to my family. So I better go wash my hands. So it happens like this. People, sometimes they can't control what they want to do, or they can't control what they do. So this is an extreme example, but there are many examples from it that we all experience in our day-to-day life. So not having perfect control over the mind's desires, its undertakings, this is a form of dukkha. So volitions are impermanent, bound up with dukkha, subject to change. Therefore, they're not mine, not I, not myself. And then finally, consciousness, which is the awareness of all of this. Generally, in the Indian tradition, there was a tendency for the thinkers, the philosophers, the sages to identify consciousness as the self, thinking that everything else changes, but the awareness is something which is like a light always shining, always bright, always persistent throughout all experience, always remaining the same. But the Buddha analyzed consciousness that's tautology. He analyzed consciousness analytically. He analyzed consciousness into distinct types of consciousness. And he explained that consciousness always arises based on a sense faculty. So there's consciousness arising through the eye, consciousness through the ear, consciousness through the nose, through the tongue, through the body, and then the inner consciousness or reflective consciousness, introspection, conceptual consciousness, mental consciousness. Okay, so consciousness is constantly, when we look at it closely, we see it's arising and passing away. Sometimes when I'm seeing a form through the eye, then there is visual consciousness. When I hear sounds, that's auditory or hearing consciousness, and so on. So the consciousness, it's arising and passing, always changing. And so consciousness too is impermanent. It's connected with suffering, subject to change. So even consciousness, the Buddha says, one should see as not mine, not I, not myself. So then in paragraph 27, he brings all of this together. Now he's hitting at the crux of his teaching. That the idea or perception or insight into non-self that will knock away the clinging to the idea of self. So he says, therefore, any kind of material form, whatever, past, future, or present, internal or external, gross or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near, all material forms should be seen as it actually is with proper wisdom. Thus, this is not mine, not I, not myself. The same with feeling, the same with perception, the same with the mental formations, the same with consciousness. All should be seen with penetrating wisdom as not mine, not I, not myself. And so this isn't just a theory about non-self, but it's actual insight. And it's insight which serves the practical purpose. The purpose is to knock away this clinging or grasping of things, especially the five aggregates, as being mine. This is mine. As being what I am. Instead, one sees this I am not. I'm not the body, not the feelings, not the perceptions, not the volitions, not even the consciousness. And this is not myself. So this is actually, it's a very useful contemplation. You don't even have to, it doesn't mean that you have to be like a great yogi, a great meditator to practice this. But I found this very useful in times when I get ill and I'm lying in bed, sometimes very weak, a lot of pain, sickness. Then usually if one doesn't have some theme to contemplate, one just lies in bed thinking, oh, how miserable I am. Why does this have to happen to me? So everything is centering around I, me, right? But if one brings up this idea, this is not mine. This body is not mine. The illness is not mine. This I am not. The pains, painful feelings, the tiredness, the exhaustion, sometimes moods of dejection. Just say it, this I am not. This is not myself. And then it becomes very liberating. Not necessarily in the sense that you gain full enlightenment and permanent liberation, but you can just endure difficult conditions in life. When you lose something of value, maybe a car that you've treasured through the years gets into an accident, and you can't use it anymore, or you have a disagreement with an old friend, and then the friendship breaks up, or your children do things that you don't want them to do. You just think, this is not mine. Each thing has its own way of acting. And then let them go. It helps to let go. Or you get into an argument with somebody, and then often you hold to your own position, your own opinion, thinking, I'm right, because that's my opinion. They're disagreeing with me, so they have to be wrong. And then you get into a fierce argument, just different opinions clash with each other. That's because both sides are holding to their view as being mine, identifying with that view. But you just consider the view not mine, it's just an idea that's occurred to me. So let's, instead of arguing, let's just try to find out what is the truth, what is the best way of doing something. And so this idea of contemplation, this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself, can be very helpful. Okay, but here the Buddha is speaking about this from the standpoint of the higher wisdom. And so when the noble disciple sees this with wisdom, then he becomes disenchanted with material form. Disenchanted with feeling, disenchanted with perception, disenchanted with the volitional formations, disenchanted with consciousness. So what is meant by disenchantment here means that one has seen through the illusions or the enchantment of taking these five aggregates to be mine, I, myself. And when one sees through that illusion, through that enchantment, then one starts to inwardly turn away from them and to let go of them. So that turning away and letting go, that is what is meant by disenchantment. The Pali word is nibbida. Okay, and as one goes on seeing again and again into the impermanent, unsatisfactory, selfless nature of the five aggregates, one goes on letting go, letting go, letting go, over and over, at deeper and deeper levels, until there comes an occasion when the attachment to the five aggregates, the clinging to them, is completely broken. Completely overthrown, overturned. And that is what is called, translated here, dispassion, viraga. Raga literally means the color when something is dyed. That color, it's raga, gives the coloration to a piece of fabric. Then when the color is completely removed from the fabric, that is viraga. And so this is what we translate dispassion, because passion is like a color that pervades the mind. then when that passion, attachment is completely removed from the mind, that experience, it's viraga, dispassion. And with the ending of passion or attachment, the mind reaches vimukti. It's liberated, liberation. So this is, when we use the word liberation, it actually means the liberation from clinging. Or we could say liberation from the three asanas, the three taints, or the three toxins, the three poisonous streams. What are these three poisonous streams? No.
Clinging to sensual pleasure.
And what else?
Clinging to existence.
Yeah.
And ignorance.
Right, very good. So it's the clinging to sensual pleasures. That's called kamasava, the flowing of this desire for sensual pleasure. Bhavasava, the flowing of attachment to continued existence. And avijjasava, the flowing of this ignorance, delusion. And when all of those three deadly streams or toxic streams dry up, that is liberation. And then he understands birth is destroyed. Now I don't like that rendering so much. It's more like you say the process of rebirth has been finished. The holy life has been lived. He's lived the complete life of the Noble Eightfold Path. He's done what had to be done. It has fully removed all of the defilements of the mind. And there is no more coming back to any state of conditioned existence in the round of rebirths. Okay, now the Buddha, maybe I'll ask at this point whether there are any questions from this presentation. I had done this last week, but I went through it rather quickly, too quickly. So I wanted to go through it again more slowly to help some of you understand better. So any questions? Okay, there are some questions from the internet. Let's see. If consciousness is always tied to the physical body, does it mean there cannot be a disembodied consciousness in the Buddha's teaching? That is, consciousness cannot leave the body. Actually, there are some passages which speak about a kind of psychic power, a spiritual power of being able to create another body similar to this physical body, and then one can draw that other body out and send it over vast distances. Apparently, in that body too, the consciousness will be present, and so it can observe things that are going on at a far distance. So there are various subtle things that take place, or various mind-boggling phenomena that take place in the subtle realm. How that works in relation to the physical body, I don't know the details. Okay, what is the main difference between the idea of this I am not, and this is not myself? Is this mainly about the so-called free will? Actually, free will is not really brought explicitly into this discussion, but the way the commentators explain the difference, they say that the idea, I am this, shows the working of what is called conceit. That is, it's a basic tendency to identify with things, not so much for the purpose of finding oneself, but for gaining some kind of self-esteem or some reason to rate oneself as being better than others, worse than others, and so on. So that is, this I am, and so the idea, I am not this, has the purpose of counteracting conceit, so that one doesn't think, I am better, I am equal, I am worse. On the other hand, the idea, this is myself, it's a speculative view, a kind of theory or doctrine or belief in a self. And so the purpose is of this is not myself, is to counteract that view of a self. Okay, does liberation of the mind also mean that the mind is detached and removed from the 5 external senses connected to the physical body, as in the jhana states? No, it doesn't necessarily mean that. Somebody who is liberated in mind, whose mind is liberated in this sense, it means that the mind is liberated from the defilements. And so the mind remains liberated under all conditions. So even if this person is engaged in the activities of day-to-day life, even if he's eating a delicious meal with maybe beautiful music playing off on the side, and dancers dancing in front of him. So all of the 5 senses are being, say, provoked or stimulated, but if the mind is completely liberated, then there's no craving or clinging to any of these objects of the senses. Okay, I'll skip there's one more question, and it's a little bit tangential, because I want to come back and then finish the sutta today. Okay, so now we come to a passage where the Buddha is going to praise the liberated one, with using a number of metaphors and images. So he says, this bhikkhu, this monk, is called one whose crossbar has been lifted, whose trench has been filled in, whose pillar has been uprooted, one who has no bolt, a noble one whose banner is lowered, whose burden is lowered, who is unfettered. And then the Buddha is going to explain each of these images. So, paragraph 31, how is this monk one whose crossbar has been lifted? So here, I'm not sure the exact reason, but the crossbar is identified with ignorance. I guess in houses where they want to prevent people from breaking in, they put a bar across the door. So that bar, it's compared to ignorance. And so one who has lifted the crossbar is one who has abandoned ignorance, cut it off at the root, made it like a palm stump, done away with it so that it cannot arise again in the future. That is how the monk is one whose crossbar has been lifted. Okay, how is the monk one whose trench has been filled in? Okay, the trench is compared now to the round of rebirths, that is samsara. And so the monk is one who has abandoned the round of rebirths, again, cut it off at the root and so on, so that it is no longer subject to future arising. Okay, how is he one whose pillar has been uprooted? Here the pillar is a metaphor for craving. So the answer is that the monk is one who has abandoned craving, cut it off at the root, and so on. How is the monk one who has no bolt? The bolt is the little latch that locks the door. Here the monk has abandoned the 5 lower fetters, cut them off at the root, and so on, so they are no longer subject to future arising. Does anybody remember what the 5 lower fetters are? Well, that's one of them, but it's not, let's take them in a proper order. Some of you are veterans, you should be able.
I'll give it a shot. Personality view,
Yeah, go.
doubt,
Good.
observing to rites and rituals,
Yeah, good.
sense desire,
Yeah.
any will.
Great, wonderful, yeah. Okay, sometimes it's translated personality view or identity view. In effect, this means the view of the self. Then the second is doubt. The third is, he said, clinging to rites and rituals or rules and rituals. Okay, that's one translation. It could be also clinging to different kinds of ascetic observances and so on. The fourth is sensual desire, sensual craving. And the fifth is ill will or hatred. Okay, so that is the bolt. How is the bhikkhu a noble one whose banner is lowered, burden is lowered, who is unfettered? So here what's called the banner, that's when you raise the banner, it's a way of showing, these are my credentials. I have a PhD from this university, I worked for 20 years with this corporation, I've won these awards. Of course, if you have all of these honors, it's great, but sometimes you meet people, as soon as they say, hello, I am Bhikkhu Bodhi, he said, oh, I am so-and-so, I have a PhD from such and such university. I worked for so many years for such and such. I remember meeting even a monk, he gave me his business card. You see the business card, president of such and such Bhikkhu Association, chief incumbent, such and such a temple, spiritual advisor to such and such a Buddhist society, religious advisor to the such and such university Buddhist youth group, assistant director of such and such an association. It seems almost as though one face of the card was not enough, you have to turn it over. Okay, so the banner, it's the symbol for conceit, the conceit I am. And so one who has lowered the banner is one who has abandoned the conceit I am, cut it off at the root, and so on. Okay, so now the Buddha has finished describing this liberated one, the Arahat. Okay, now we come to a few difficult passages in this sutta. The Buddha, beginning paragraph 36, when the gods, together with Indra, with Brahma, and with Prajapati, these are the Vedic deities, seek a monk who is thus liberated in mind, they do not find, and these words are put in brackets, I think I just added them to help the sentence, anything of which they could say, let's just keep that out, they do not find the consciousness of one thus gone is supported by this. Why is that? One thus gone is untraceable here and now. Now the expression that's rendered here, one thus gone, in Pali, it's Tathagata. Now the word Tathagata, usually in the text, it's an epithet for the Buddha. So the Buddha, when he speaks about himself, he refers to himself as the Tathagata. And it means literally one who has gone, one who has thus gone, sometimes rendered, one who has gone to thusness, or one who has gone to the truth, one who has realized the truth. But in this passage, the Buddha is not restricting the word Tathagata to a fully enlightened Buddha, but to anyone who is completely liberated, to any Arhat. And so he says that even the gods, sometimes they seek to understand the mind of the human being. But when they seek to understand the mind of the Arhat, they don't find that mind or consciousness being supported by anything, in the sense of having any point of attachment, anything that's holding the mind down. So the mind of a liberated one, we could say metaphorically, it's like the sky. Sometimes even, I think it's the Dhammapada speaks about just as the birds fly across the sky without leaving any track in the sky. And so mental events will take place in the mind of a Arhat or Buddha. They don't leave any traces or tracks. And then sometimes in the suttas we find Mara. Mara is the evil one, like the devil. But he's not really evil like the Christian Satan who wants to drag people to hell. But Mara just wants to keep people bound by attachment to the realm of sensual enjoyment. And so sometimes Mara goes looking for the mind of an Arhat, and he searches and searches, but can't find anything, because there's no point of attachment there. And so the Buddha says, one thus gone is untraceable here and now. And so we could see the body of an Arhat, we could see him going about his day-to-day activities, but there's nothing that we could trace within the mind in the sense of any kind of point of clinging or attachment. Even the sense, I am this, is not in the mind anymore. What that mind is like, maybe some of you know, I don't know myself. Still, as long as we have a lot of attachment to I and mine, it's very difficult to understand the mind which is completely without I and mine. But because there's no attachment to I and mine, it's said that the liberated one, or the one who has gone thus, gone to the ultimate truth, is untraceable, unfindable, undiscoverable. So we see this represented in early Buddhist art from a very early period. Now whenever you hear Buddhist art, the first thing you think of is a Buddha image, right? And even any Buddhist temple, you go into the temple, and the center of the temple is the Buddha image. But in the first 4 centuries, 3 or 4 centuries of Buddhism, no Buddha images. There was art, there was sculpture, but when you see pieces of Buddhist sculpture, there might be like a group of people, like devotees surrounding a place in the middle, which is where the Buddha should be. But instead of seeing the figure of the Buddha, all one sees is a footprint to represent the Buddha, or sometimes the Bodhi tree to represent the Buddha. Because they were trying to represent this idea that an enlightened one is untraceable. There are no tracks by which one could trace the liberated one. And so how did the Buddha statue, Buddha image come into Buddhist art? Who is responsible for that?
Greeks.
Yeah, it was Greek colonies, colonies of people of Greek descent that had settled in an area which is now part of Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan that was called Gandhara. And so the Greeks were familiar with the practice of representing their deities with statues. And so Greek sculptors would make sculptures of the Buddha, who, if you have seen statues of Gandhara art, the Buddha looks very much like the Greek god Apollo. In fact, the facial features are more Greek than Indian. Okay, so now the Buddha continues. He says, "So saying, so proclaiming, I have been baselessly, vainly, falsely, and wrongly misrepresented by some reckless